The governor who once preached family values found herself cornered, exposed, and humiliated, not by a rival politician, but by the unshakable truth of Jasmine Crockett. It began with a single exchange, one moment that cut through the noise of politics as usual and revealed something far deeper: the fragility of hypocrisy when confronted by courage. Cameras captured Sarah Huckabee Sanders, her voice strained, her face flushed, as she leaned into her old familiar tactics of deflection and indignation. But this time, her well-rehearsed lines did not land. They crumbled in real time. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, almost serene. She didn't interrupt, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she waited, letting Sanders spin herself into fury, letting the weight of empty rhetoric hang heavy in the room. And then, with a calm precision that felt like a blade sliding silently from its sheath, Crockett delivered the words that stripped away the pretense, a reminder of Sanders' own contradictions, a mirror held up to power that had long demanded accountability from others while excusing itself. The chamber fell still. The energy shifted. For once, Sanders' force of personality, that booming cadence she had used to bulldoze through White House press briefings and campaign rallies, was powerless. The silence was not on her side. It belonged to Crockett. It belonged to truth. In that moment, Sanders did something uncharacteristic. She faltered. Her voice, once sharp, cracked with something uncomfortably close to panic. Her attempt to double down sounded less like confidence and more like desperation. The very values she claimed to defend, faith, family, integrity, were laid bare as talking points, hollow and brittle under Crockett's unflinching stare. Viewers at home felt it instantly. This wasn't just another political spat. It was a role reversal, a toppling of the expected order. The one who had long been shielded by privilege and position was suddenly defenseless, while the one dismissed as an underdog became the voice commanding the room. The chamber, the cameras, the millions watching, all bore witness to a reckoning. And yet, the question still lingered, hanging like a storm cloud over the scene. What exactly had driven Sanders into this unraveling spiral? But what sparked this meltdown? And why did it leave the entire chamber in stunned silence? To understand why this moment hit with such force, we have to rewind. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has long fashioned herself as the torchbearer of so-called family values. From her days at the White House podium to her current seat in the governor's office, she has worn morality like a shield, insisting that her vision of faith and integrity represents the heart of America. But beneath that polished exterior lies a record riddled with contradictions. She preached accountability for others while excusing herself. She railed against big government, but happily wielded power to silence dissent. She exalted the sanctity of family while backing policies that tore vulnerable families apart. Her critics saw it clearly, a pattern of hypocrisy. But for years, Sanders thrived on the presumption that loud certainty could drown out quiet truth. The tactic worked until it met a voice unwilling to flinch. Enter Jasmine Crockett. Young, sharp, and unapologetically unbothered by the theatre of political intimidation, she represents something Sanders was never prepared to face: authenticity armed with evidence. Crockett isn't a creature of spin. She is a product of lived struggle, a lawyer who built her name defending rights that politicians like Sanders dismissed as disposable. Where Sanders leaned on slogans, Crockett leaned on facts. Where Sanders projected confidence, Crockett embodied conviction. That's what made the confrontation bigger than two women, bigger than two parties. It wasn't merely political theatre. It was archetypal. One stood for rhetoric, the other for reality. One clung to privilege, the other carried dignity. Their collision was the collision of two Americas, the one that excuses power no matter how corrupted, and the one that demands accountability no matter how inconvenient. And the stakes could not have been higher. Sanders, seated in her gubernatorial authority, expected deference. She expected Crockett to play her role, to absorb the attacks, to bow under the pressure of the chamber's weight. But Crockett wasn't there to perform subservience. She was there to speak truth, and in doing so, to challenge an entire structure that had long normalized hypocrisy. Viewers felt it in their bones. This wasn't about partisanship, it was about justice. The hypocrisy Sanders embodied was the same hypocrisy millions had endured. Leaders who promised virtue while delivering pain. Leaders who demanded sacrifice but never offered their own. Crockett's presence in that room symbolized more than a rebuttal. It was vindication. It was the long-awaited moment when dignity finally stared hypocrisy in the face. And yet, what made the exchange so compelling wasn't only Crockett's words. It was the way Sanders herself crumbled under the weight of her own contradictions. Long before Crockett delivered the cutting truth, Sanders' unraveling had already begun. Her rising volume, her frantic attempts to regain control, they betrayed the reality that the governor was not the master of the stage. She was already losing ground, and everyone watching could sense it. The chamber leaned forward. Viewers, at home, gripped their screens. Something electric was about to happen, and everyone knew it. But before Crockett even opened her mouth, Sanders had already set herself up for disaster. To understand the force of the confrontation, you have to understand the woman who unraveled at its center. Sarah Huckabee Sanders has long been cast as the inheritor of a political dynasty, the daughter of Arkansas's former governor, and a figure who rose not through quiet perseverance, but through the carefully paved pathways of legacy. From the very start, she cultivated an image of unflappable control. As White House press secretary under Donald Trump, she stood at the podium day after day, sparring with reporters, wielding spin like a sword and deflection like a shield. To her allies, she was tough, loyal, unshakable. To her critics, she was the embodiment of shamelessness, willing to bend reality itself if it meant protecting power. It was at that podium where Sanders perfected her craft. She did not sweat under fire, at least not outwardly. She stared down tough questions and turned them into talking points. She dismissed facts as fake news when they didn't serve her. She weaponized her faith and family as rhetorical armor, implying that to question her was to question the values of Middle America itself. She smiled through the lies, and she was rewarded for it. Power embraced her, not because she spoke truth, but because she never let truth get in the way. When she returned home to Arkansas and claimed the governor's seat, she carried that same playbook with her. She cast herself as the guardian of morality, the protector of children, the champion of integrity. Her speeches bristled with certainty, her policies cloaked in righteousness. Yet behind every pronouncement lay contradiction. She pledged to defend families while slashing programs that supported working parents. She spoke of transparency while shutting down inquiries into her administration's spending. She preached about education while pushing culture war battles that drained resources from classrooms. Over and over, her public words told one story, while her actions told another. This was the essence of her persona, a façade of conviction masking a reality of self-interest. And the more she wrapped herself in the language of faith and virtue, the more brittle that façade became. Because underneath the grand proclamations lay insecurity, the gnawing truth that her authority rested not on trust, but on fear. She could command a podium, but she could not command authenticity. She could deliver a sermon, but she could not live it. Yet for years, that brittle arrogance held. She faced critics, yes, but she always had the advantage of the microphone, the title, the machinery of power. She could dismiss challenges as partisan. She could drown dissent in sound bites, and the cameras often played along. To many, she seemed untouchable, unshakable, a fortress of discipline and defiance. But every fortress has its cracks. Watch closely, and you could see the moments when her mask slipped, when a question hit too close, when her voice rose just a little too sharply, when her eyes flashed not confidence, but irritation. These were the tells of a politician who survived by projection, not by principle, and those tells would only grow more visible when she was stripped of her familiar stage, facing not a room of reporters she could dismiss, but a fellow lawmaker unwilling to bend. That is what made Jasmine Crockett so dangerous to her image. Sanders' persona thrived on control, the ability to define the narrative, to shut down opposition with sheer force of will. Crockett, calm and composed, refused to play by those rules. She didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, didn't grant Sanders the deference she demanded. In doing so, she left Sanders exposed. For the first time, the governor's well-rehearsed act was not enough. The irony is that Sanders' undoing was always hidden in plain sight. Her contradictions were not secrets. They were on the record, written into policy, documented in history. But power had insulated her, shielded her from true accountability. Until now. Because in this confrontation, Sanders wasn't just facing a critic, she was facing a mirror. And mirrors are merciless. They reflect not the story you want to tell, but the truth you can't escape. The cracks were there all along. All it would take was one voice, steady, unflinching, to split them wide open. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words landed like thunder, you have to understand the path she walked to get there. Unlike Sarah Huckabee Sanders, whose trajectory was smoothed by dynasty and privilege, Crockett carved her way forward through grit, persistence, and the unyielding demand to be heard. Born and raised in St. Louis, she didn't arrive in politics with a silver spoon or a famous last name. She arrived with a calling, one forged in the courtroom, standing beside clients who had no one else willing to fight for them. As a civil rights attorney, Crockett spent her early career in spaces where justice was not guaranteed but contested, where the system seemed designed to break the very people she vowed to defend. She defended protesters when the world wanted to silence them. She defended the vulnerable when the powerful wanted to discard them. Every case was a reminder. Truth alone isn't enough. You need courage to carry it. Crockett built her reputation on fearlessness. In the Texas House, she became known as one of the sharpest voices willing to challenge entrenched power. Colleagues underestimated her at first, dismissing her as too fiery, too young, too unwilling to wait her turn. But every time she was underestimated, she returned sharper. She knew that the same traits used to dismiss her, her passion, her directness, her refusal to shrink herself, were also her greatest strengths. Her rise wasn't without scars. She faced constant attacks on her style, on her voice, on her very presence in rooms that were never designed for women like her. Critics tried to paint her confidence as arrogance, her determination as anger. They tried to twist her sharp, questioning into disrespect. But Crockett didn't fold. She learned to turn the labels thrown at her into armor. She learned to let the noise fuel her clarity. Each attempt to silence her only sharpened her resolve to speak louder, clearer, with more precision than before, and that reputation followed her to Congress. In hearings watched by millions, Crockett became the lawmaker who refused to be bulldozed. When others yielded, she pressed on. When witnesses tried to dance around the truth, she cut through with surgical precision. Her questions weren't just questions. They were indictments, cornering the evasive, exposing the hypocritical, forcing the truth into daylight. It was in those moments, broadcast to the public, that she showed what set her apart. She wasn't performing for the camera, she was performing for justice. That spirit of persistence made her more than a politician. To many watching, she became a symbol, a reminder that dignity isn't about titles or legacy. It's about standing tall when everything around you tries to push you down. Where Sanders projected moral certainty, Crockett embodied lived conviction. Where Sanders wore faith like a costume, Crockett lived her values like skin. The contrast could not have been sharper. One born into power, the other forged by struggle. One rehearsed, the other real. And this was the dynamic that would explode in the chamber, because Sanders, with her history of dismissing challenges and assuming control, had never truly faced someone like Jasmine Crockett. She had faced reporters, yes. She had faced critics, yes. But she had never faced a voice that combined legal precision with unshakable moral clarity. A voice that could cut not just through policy points, but through the very foundation of her platform. For Crockett, this wasn't just about politics. It was personal in the deepest sense. Every insult she had endured, every dismissal she had pushed through, every underestimation she had survived, prepared her for this. She knew what it was to be underestimated, and she knew how powerful it was when the underestimated finally spoke. That was her weapon. The ability to remain calm while the other side grew frantic, to turn dignity into a force more devastating than anger ever could be. Her resilience was her training ground. While Sanders' mask cracked at the first sign of challenge, Crockett had lived through years of being challenged at every step. Where Sanders grew brittle under pressure, Crockett grew sharper. Where Sanders relied on inherited authority, Crockett relied on earned respect. And in that chamber, those differences mattered more than any title or position. The audience watching could feel the imbalance before a word was exchanged. On one side, a governor leaning on authority. On the other, a congresswoman leaning on truth. One rattled, the other unshaken. It was the story of their careers distilled into a single confrontation, a single clash of worldviews. And that's why Sanders never saw it coming. She believed her familiar tactics, the bluster, the deflection, the self-righteous tone, would carry her through. She believed Crockett would fold under pressure, just as so many had before. But Crockett wasn't just another critic. She was the living embodiment of dignity, standing in defiance of arrogance. And that changed everything. So when Sanders stepped into the arena with Crockett, she had no idea that history was about to flip the script. The chamber pulsed with an almost cinematic tension. Bright overhead lights bore down like interrogation lamps, while cameras from every angle tracked the two women at the center of it all. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised, as if the air itself were charged with static. Everyone knew something was about to break, though no one could yet tell how. Sarah Huckabee Sanders took the floor with her trademark bravado. Her voice rose, echoing against the chamber walls, each sentence sharp and accusatory. She gestured broadly, her tone swelling into a crescendo designed to dominate the space. Sanders was in her element, or at least she thought she was. Years at the podium had taught her that volume meant victory, that drowning out the opposition was the same as defeating it. She leaned hard into that instinct now, cutting through the air with a force meant to overwhelm. But across from her, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless, composed. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, almost unnervingly calm. While Sanders' voice pitched higher and higher, Crockett sat like the eye of the storm. She didn't flinch. She didn't fidget. She let the storm rage around her, waiting, absorbing, watching. The contrast between them was stark, one thrashing with noise, the other radiating control. The audience in the chamber noticed. Murmurs rippled through the seats as Sanders, in her attempt to project strength, began to reveal something else entirely. Desperation. She interrupted herself, doubled back on points, repeated phrases, as if trying to make them true by sheer force of will. Each time she raised her voice, it sounded less like authority and more like panic clawing for legitimacy. And still, Crockett waited. Every camera in the room began to shift focus, cutting less to Sanders' wide gestures and more to Crockett's stillness. The silence on her side of the table grew louder than Sanders' booming declarations. It was the kind of silence that commanded attention, the kind that carried more power than 100 raised voices. Sanders pressed harder. She interrupted, trying to seize every second before Crockett could respond. She talked over even imagined rebuttals, anticipating them and cutting them off with phrases rehearsed 100 times before. But the harder she pushed, the more brittle her performance became. The chamber's murmurs turned into low laughter in places, quiet disbelief in others. Sanders' control of the room was slipping, and everyone could feel it. Crockett leaned forward slightly, just enough to signal she was ready. The subtle movement was enough to send another ripple across the chamber. She didn't need to raise her hand. She didn't need to shout over Sanders. Her timing was perfect. She let Sanders exhaust herself, burn through every line of indignation, until the performance began to collapse under its own weight. For a brief second, the governor hesitated. Her voice cracked. It was the pause Crockett had been waiting for. The pause the entire chamber had been waiting for. The storm had raged long enough. Now the silence was about to speak, and then, with the nation watching, Crockett struck. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze in silence. Sanders's words hung awkwardly in the air, brittle and unfinished, like a glass about to shatter. That pause, that split second of hesitation, was all Jasmine Crockett needed. She leaned forward, not with bluster, not with volume, but with the quiet authority of someone who knows the truth is on her side. Her first words came softly, almost conversationally, but their weight landed like stone against glass. "Governor," she began, her tone steady, "you speak about protecting families, yet your policies cut childcare support, push mothers out of the workforce, and punish the very people who make this country strong." The chamber shifted, heads turned. Reporters looked up from their notes. Crockett's calm cadence drew the oxygen from Sanders' performance, replacing noise with clarity. Every syllable was deliberate, every pause purposeful. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Sanders tried to interject, her voice strained with urgency, but Crockett didn't take the bait. She let the interruption hang in the air for a moment, then continued as though nothing had been said. "You preach accountability," she pressed, "yet when your own office was questioned about spending, about contracts hidden from the public, you silenced inquiries. That's not accountability, that's concealment." The murmurs grew louder. A rustle moved through the chamber like wind through tall grass. People were no longer reacting to Sanders. They were reacting to Crockett. Sanders straightened in her chair, her face tightening, her voice pitching higher as she shot back about liberal agendas and partisan attacks. But Crockett simply tilted her head, waiting. She didn't need to shout over her opponent. She let Sanders' panic amplify itself. The contrast was devastating. One woman unraveling, the other holding steady. Then Crockett delivered her next strike. You invoke faith as though it belongs to you alone. But faith without honesty is nothing more than theatre. You can't preach integrity on Sunday and govern with hypocrisy on Monday. That's not faith, that's fraud. Gasps rippled across the room. It wasn't just the words, it was the calm with which they were delivered, as if Crockett were merely stating a fact that everyone already knew, but had been too afraid to say aloud. Sanders' bravado wavered. Her voice, once booming, faltered with defensiveness. She stammered through familiar lines about her values and protecting the people of Arkansas, but the rhythm was gone. Her performance, usually airtight, was unraveling thread by thread. Crockett leaned in further. You talk about protecting children, she said, voice cutting sharper now. But under your watch, children in Arkansas schools lost access to free lunches. Families are struggling while you posture about morality. Governor, tell me, whose children are you protecting? Because it's not theirs. The chamber erupted, audible gasps, murmurs turning into a low roar of disbelief. Sanders' face reddened as she tried to deflect, insisting the facts were misrepresented. But the room wasn't buying it. The energy had shifted entirely. Crockett's calm truth was a current, sweeping Sanders' protests aside like driftwood in a flood. The governor's tone changed again. No longer smug, no longer commanding, now defensive, sharp-edged, almost pleading with the audience to believe her. That's not fair, she snapped, her voice cracking. That's not the full story. But Crockett didn't relent. She paused, letting the governor's words echo awkwardly, and then delivered the line that silenced the entire chamber. You don't get to lecture America on values while your record screams the opposite. Hypocrisy isn't leadership, Governor. It's cowardice dressed in scripture. For a moment, it felt as if time itself stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye in the chamber turned to Sanders, waiting for a response that would not come. The cameras zoomed in on her face, her jaw tight, her eyes flickering with a panic she couldn't mask. And then the crowd noise rose again. Gasps, murmurs, even a few audible chuckles from the back of the room. The mighty governor, who had once bulldozed through press rooms with ease, now sat exposed, every contradiction laid bare by a calm voice that refused to bend. The catharsis for viewers at home was palpable. This wasn't just a debate moment. It was justice in real time. It was every frustration with hypocrisy, every exhaustion with empty rhetoric, transformed into a clean, undeniable takedown. Crockett hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't matched Sanders's theatrics. She had done something far more devastating. She had let dignity win. Sanders tried to recover, grasping at lines that once commanded loyalty. But they fell flat. The harder she fought to regain control, the more obvious it became that she had already lost it. The weight of Crockett's words hung in the air like a verdict, impossible to overturn. Crockett leaned back slightly, her expression calm, almost serene. She didn't need to say anything more. The mic drop had already landed. The chamber knew it. The cameras knew it. Sanders knew it most of all. And that was the final humiliation. Not that she had been shouted down. Not that she had been disrespected, but that she had been defeated by nothing more than the unshakable truth. The chamber vibrated with energy, the sense that something irreversible had just occurred. The performance was over. The façade had crumbled. Sanders's carefully curated image lay in ruins, undone by a voice that refused to be silenced. But the chamber wasn't the only place that erupted. What happened next spread far beyond those walls. The moment Crockett's words landed, the EA chamber erupted. But the real explosion happened beyond those walls. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were racing across the internet. A shaky cell phone video from the back of the room hit Twitter first, then exploded onto every feed imaginable. By the time the official broadcast cut into news segments, the hashtags were already climbing the charts. Crockett Truth and Jasmine Sanders Exposed lit up timelines like neon signs. Users poured in with reactions that blended outrage, vindication, and sheer exhilaration. Finally, one post read, paired with the viral clip of Sanders stammering, "Someone said what we've all been thinking." Another showed Crockett leaning in, calm and sharp, captioned, "This is what strength actually looks like." The tweets cascaded into thousands, then millions. It wasn't just a debate moment anymore. It had become a cultural moment. Memes arrived within hours. Sanders' reddened face, frozen mid-deflection, was plastered next to cartoon captions. Hypocrisy.exe has stopped responding. Another spliced her shouting with a clip of Crockett sipping tea. Silent but devastating. The rhythm of internet. Humor worked like an amplifier. Every joke carried Crockett's words further. Every meme hammered Sanders' unraveling into the public consciousness. By evening, the confrontation was the lead story on every major network. Cable hosts replayed the mic drop line on loop, dissecting Sanders' body language like analysts breaking down a prize fight. "You can see the exact moment she loses the room," one commentator said, pausing the footage at the flicker in Sanders' eyes. And Crockett, she doesn't even blink. Late-night comedians joined the chorus, weaving Crockett's dismantling into their monologues. "Governor Sanders claimed she was defending values," one joked. "But the only value she defended was the value of Crockett's closing line," the audience roared. The laughter wasn't just humor. It was release, the sound of people who had been waiting for this moment of reckoning. But beyond the jokes, there was a deeper current running through the coverage. Editorials framed the exchange not as a clash of personalities, but as a clash of principles. Here was the old politics of double standards and empty slogans, embodied in Sanders, colliding with a new voice that refused to play by those rules. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She was giving language to a frustration that millions had carried for years. On TikTok, younger viewers remixed the confrontation into soundbites layered with music, turning Crockett's words into rallying anthems. One video overlaid her line about cowardice dressed in scripture, with a pulsing beat, captioned, "This is going to live rent-free in my head forever." Within hours, it had tens of thousands of shares. For progressive-leaning audiences, immigrants, students, workers, people long dismissed or silenced, the moment landed like a promise fulfilled. They weren't just watching politics. They were watching dignity triumph over arrogance in real time. It was validation, sharp and emotional. You are not crazy. The hypocrisy is real, and it can be challenged. Everywhere, people described the same visceral satisfaction. A woman in Detroit posted, "As a mum working 2 jobs, hearing Crockett call out the hypocrisy on family values nearly brought me to tears. That's what standing up for us looks like." In Houston, a college student wrote, "This was more than politics. This was someone finally fighting back the way we've always wanted to." And with that sense of connection came something even stronger: belonging. Viewers weren't just spectators. They were part of the surge, part of the cultural earthquake shaking loose the old facades of power. Sharing the clip, laughing at the memes, joining the trending hashtags. It all became a way of saying, "I was here. I saw it. I'm part of this moment. Sanders's allies scrambled to reframe the meltdown, issuing statements about media bias and performative politics. But it was too late. The narrative had already left their control, carried by millions of voices louder than any press release could ever hope to be. By the next morning, newspapers across the country carried headlines about Sanders' humiliation. Some called it the unraveling of an image. Others described Crockett as a rising star with a scalpel for hypocrisy. Even outlets typically sympathetic to Sanders couldn't ignore the spectacle. The footage was everywhere. The verdict was already in. For Sanders, the damage was political. For Crockett, the triumph was symbolic. But for the people watching, the meaning was personal. They felt seen, defended, and, for once, victorious. The hypocrisy that had weighed so heavily on public life had been dragged into the light and shattered by one voice refusing to bend. And yet, as powerful as the cultural aftershocks were, they pointed to something even bigger. The confrontation wasn't just about Sanders's stumble or Crockett's rise. It was about what people wanted, what they demanded, in those who claimed to lead them. But the greatest impact wasn't on Sanders's career. It was on the values Americans are demanding in their leaders. In the days that followed, as headlines blared and social feeds kept replaying that moment, something deeper began to crystallize. What Jasmine Crockett had delivered wasn't just a takedown of one politician's hypocrisy. It was a reminder of a universal truth. Dignity will always outlast arrogance. Service will always outshine selfishness. And truth, even when buried under layers of spin, will always find a way to break through. For years, political life had been dominated by noise, the shouting, the posturing, the endless theatre of performance. Leaders like Sarah Huckabee Sanders built their power on volume, on declaring themselves moral arbiters, while bending rules and twisting narratives to their own ends. They spoke in absolutes while living in contradictions, and too often that act went unchallenged. Until now, Crockett's composure revealed something profound. Real strength doesn't need to shout. Real conviction doesn't need to hide behind slogans. Where Sanders relied on bluster, Crockett relied on principle. Where Sanders deflected, Crockett confronted. The clash became a mirror, showing in stark relief the emptiness of hypocrisy against the clarity of truth, and audiences across the country felt it. They saw in Crockett's calm rebuttal a reflection of themselves. The worker dismissed by a boss, the immigrant talked over by authority, the student told their questions didn't matter. Every person who had been silenced or ignored recognized the power in her refusal to be drowned out. Her stand wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever carried the weight of injustice on their shoulders. This is why the moment spread so far, so fast. It wasn't politics as usual. It was a cultural reckoning. In an era where deception so often drowns out honesty, Crockett proved that truth still has teeth, still has resonance, still has the ability to cut through the fog. And more than that, it proved that truth can inspire. There was something cinematic in it all. The bluster of power meeting the patience of dignity, the roar collapsing under the weight of silence, the audience in the chamber, the millions watching, online, all witnessing a moral turning point. It wasn't just about who won an exchange. It was about what kind of leadership people want to believe in again. Crockett reframed the clash without even needing to declare it outright. Public. Service isn't about dominance, it's about responsibility. It isn't about who can shout the loudest, but who can stand the firmest when the truth is on the line. She reminded the country that dignity isn't passive. It is a force, and when wielded against hypocrisy, it is unstoppable. For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone who had long felt voiceless, this was more than catharsis. It was hope. Hope that arrogance doesn't get the final word. Hope that hypocrisy, no matter how well polished, will crack under pressure. And hope that voices like Crockett's can rise and inspire others to rise alongside her. Because this moment wasn't just a story about two women in a chamber. It was about the values that endure when everything else falls apart. Dignity, service, truth. These aren't partisan ideals, they're human ones, and they will always outlast the arrogance of those who pretend otherwise. Which leads to the question that lingers, the one this confrontation leaves hanging in the air. If one voice can cut through hypocrisy this powerfully, imagine what happens when millions stand together. Sarah Huckabee Sanders walked into that chamber certain of her dominance. She believed that volume and posturing could carry the day, but instead she left rattled, exposed, and humiliated, undone not by theatrics, but by the calm precision of Jasmine Crockett. One moment of truth shattered years of carefully polished spin, and the nation saw hypocrisy stripped bare. This was never just a clash between two politicians. It was a reminder of something bigger. That when arrogance shouts, dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. When hypocrisy builds walls of deception, truth has the power to tear them down. Crockett showed us that clarity, confidence, and conviction can silence the loudest bluster. And here's where you come in. If you believe that dignity must always defeat arrogance, that truth should always rise above lies, then this is your moment to stand with us. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and help make sure that moments like these aren't buried under noise. Every view, every share, every voice added to this movement matters, because the more we amplify truth, the less room hypocrisy has to hide. We are not just spectators in this drama, we are part of its continuation. Sanders' meltdown may have been televised, but the real legacy belongs to those who carry forward the lesson. When we choose dignity over arrogance, when we speak with courage instead of fear, we write the next chapter. Because in the end, hypocrisy collapses under its own weight, but dignity always stands tall.